No
All right,
problem.
let's
Thank
officially
you.
start. So the agenda for our meeting this morning is to review our 2011 initiatives, which we're taking government-wide, IT and the SES initiatives, to get an update on strategic sourcing, an update on improper payments. We'll build in a break or two, and I think this will last a couple of hours or so. And let's start by handing it over to Scott, just to give a sense of where we are overall.
Excellent.
You're now on page 3, Scott?
Just behind tab 2, page 3. Thank you and welcome, everyone, for today's meeting of the President's Management Advisory Board. We are going to be in an open meeting today. As each of these meetings takes place, it's obviously going to be webcast, so all of the conversation will be broadcast simultaneously. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If anyone's looking for restrooms, just out the door to the right or to the left, just at the end of each of the hallways.
So that's men's is both directions and women's is both directions?
I've been told that's the case by Roxanne.
Okay. I know there's a men's room to the left. I think to the right for women's, but we will help you.
Excellent.
Get to the restroom.
Thank you, Jeff. I feel much better now.
Additionally,
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
I was thinking the same thing.
All right, I've already screwed up here.
No. Sorry, Scott.
that's fine. Coffee is outside if you want coffee. Water is in here as well. We are seated today in this office a little bit closer quarters than we are typically used to, so apologies if we're a little bit on each other, but we're all friends and it'll all be fine. What I wanted to do on page 3 is just walk through the work that's gone on across the course of 2012. This really kind of mirrors the time that I've been working with the President's Management Advisory Board. We met back in March, chose the 2 topic areas, the 2 focus areas for 2012, improper payment, strategic sourcing. A number of meetings have taken place across the course of the year. Obviously, back in September, we approved the recommendations from each of the 2 subcommittees. You can find those recommendations behind tab 5 if you are not fully familiar with what those were. And today, we're really going to be reviewing progress that's been made against those recommendations across the last 6 to 8 weeks, as well as looking at some of the early successes that have come out from the recommendations that you all have delivered. And then looking forward, just in the new year, we'll be meeting again for a meeting of the President's Management Advisory Board, where we'll be talking again about some of the ongoing work against the 2012 initiatives, as well as some of the new focus areas for 2013.
We haven't set the date yet for the early.
We've not set the date yet. No.
We will do that soon. Yes, we'll be cognizant of ski season.
It's rubbing it
It's
in.
getting to be a bit much.
So with that, let me go ahead and get started. Steve Van Roel, who has just joined us, is going to be talking about the information technology updates from the 2011 initiatives. Anything else before we start, Jeff?
No. Hey, Steve, it's been about a year now that you've been in this position.
Yes, year and 3 months.
Remind folks quickly where your private sector experience, your FCC experience, and then just give a minute or two on life 15 months in.
Great. So I came from about 2 decades in the private sector on the West Coast, working for a large software company, and had
Microsoft.
It was a startup when I joined. Spent a bit of time there as Bill Gates' assistant, and then the last job was part of the leadership team running the server and tools division, which was a great experience. We, in my tenure in server and tools, we had 26 consecutive quarters of double-digit growth, and I only say that because the applicability to government was keeping the cost line low and keeping the value line going up and to the right, and just a maniacal mindset. And the difference I think I saw when I came from private sector to public sector was, the sense of the greater whole was there, in that, my budget never went up. We never saw, massive increases as our profit line went up and to the right. It was always funding other aspects of the enterprise to scale the business, Xbox Mobile, other things that were happening in the company, and it, that isn't as apparent in government. You have a lot more mindset where I'm going to be insular in my silo. I'm going to, whatever value I provide, I'm going to provide here. And many times, looking at a return on investment, if the ROI is not realized in the silo, the effort won't be there to realize to drive the ROI. And so you get a lot of that mindset. So we've been running this administration, I think, has been running an exhaustive process to think about how do we normalize all of that and pull that forward. I came to the government and to the administration in 2009. I came up to the inauguration not looking for a job. A job found me after a lunch with a friend out here that encouraged me to join the team and join the Federal Communications Commission for the first 2 years, running operations there, and found an agency which should have been on the avant-garde of technology, given the oversight of spectrum, mobile, to some extent internet and other things, and found an agency that was very behind the times. An operating system that I had actually launched almost a decade before was waiting for me at my desk when I showed up, and we had just so many bad things going wrong with a very low ranking on the best places to work scale in government. I think we were second or third from the bottom, right above selective service coming in. And so it was a tough go from kind of bringing culture and efficiency and other things. And the magic mixture of improving IT, improving employee relationships and other things was sort of essential. It's an interesting thing, and I think a lot of times when we sit in these PMAB meetings, you get the question around incentives. That's one of the most difficult things in government. As you come in, you don't have the financial incentive tools, you don't have a lot of the other things. But what I found to be most powerful in that motion of going to the FCC was looking at the strategic plan for the agency, which every year you're required by statute to kind of put out your strategic plan and list your priority objectives. About every third year, reform the agency was listed on the strategic objectives, and then the next year it would disappear. And so they would just sort of this constant drumbeat of it's like, let's sort of mess things up and then let's reform, and then let's mess things up and let's reform again. And there wasn't sort of that captured spirit of continuous improvement. Let's just wake up every day, think about how we do things better, and that reform and that sense of improvement wasn't in the hands of the employees from an incentive standpoint. And so thinking about it, probably as you go through today, I think you're going to get even more in questions about incentives as we think about that. It's sort of one of the things that we struggle with in government is how do you incent people. Patriotism gets you only so far, gets you a long way. It's amazing, but there's other things we can do. And so I came to the White House, as I said, a year and about 3 months ago. Into an administration that I think had done amazing work on really slowing down bad behavior in the spending on federal IT. We were growing at about a 7% CAGR for the last 15 years spend, and without tools like depreciation, without using the balance sheet as a strategic tool, using it solely as an auditing tool, growing spend was the only way to really deliver new value. And so we froze that spend in 2009, and actually on my watch we've taken it down just a little bit. Not that I think that hard times are not the time to invest in technology, because I think it actually is, but this is the time to stop bad behavior and to promote good behavior. And so the last year in the process we've run through this through our learning and investment review boards, vendor management.
You're on 5 now, page 5.
Yeah, page 5, and portfolio stat was really about. How do we innovate with less? How do we steal from the OpEx column to give to the CapEx column to actually do new things in the context of a flat or declining budget? How do we keep that cost line low and value going up and to the right, and kind of keep that theme going? And so we, on the heels of this, have institutionalized a process that I launched. Jeff and I actually launched 2 PMAB meetings ago. Last meeting, I gave you an update to talk about that we had sort of started to see the glimmers of some potential. This portfolio stat process, which is page 6, we basically went out and asked agencies to first gather a bunch of data for us. Look left to right across the organization and understand, what's going on inside your organization from an IT investment standpoint, and with a particular focus on looking in the dark corners, because we know that only headquarters only gets a view into certain things, and we needed to look and cascade information across. So we did that. We then asked each agency to then develop, or each department to develop a plan for consolidation, with a particular focus on commodity consolidation. We thought that was a low-hanging fruit, even though there's departments and agencies are kind of all over the board on where they are. We then, over the month since I've seen you last, and we were in the midst of that data gathering, I think when I saw you last, spent the entire month of July meeting with 28 agencies face-to-face. And Deputy Secretary Poneman was in one of those meetings. And
everybody remembers Dan, Deputy Secretary of Energy.
Yeah.
Hey, everyone. Good morning.
And we had a face-to-face meeting with senior leadership all at the table: Deputy Secretary, CFO, CIOs, in some cases component CIOs, acquisition, human capital, all the people around the table, with the secret agenda of teaching agencies how to run an investment review board, really based on what we had learned from a lot of my experience in the private sector, and especially the time we had spent with your companies learning how to do this, with vendor management as an underpinning and other things. And what we saw had some amazing conversations and saw some really amazing results on opportunities for people. So we sat down, kind of fine-tuned their plans coming in, and then at the end of September at the end of August into September required that they all submit final plans with cost-saving targets and what they were doing. And we also dovetail these efforts with a new approach to enterprise architecture and a new approach to some modular contracting, some other things that are all moving parts that have to be satisfied to get this stuff done. And what we saw across the whole of government was really a spectrum of places where people were as an agency. You had kind of on the far extreme the Department of Fiefdoms, where everybody were highly siloed, where everyone is doing separate things, where there were 1,000 ways of buying a mobile device, there were 20 different email systems, there were all those sort of things, to an emergence on the other extreme, which was starting to see real service orientation, embracing cloud computing, starting to say, okay, when somebody in a corner of my organization comes to me and says I need to develop a mobile app, you say, great, I've got a development environment as a service, I've got a test environment as a service, I've got a platform to host it on. And I always think about that as good parenting, right, where you give your 2-year-old the choices you want and they get to choose between them, and pulling that in together, I think is a good thing. We're starting to see that on the other extreme in small glimmers across government, and agencies and departments are kind of somewhere between those two spectrums, from starting to consolidate their commodity stuff to looking at kind of rationalizing their use of apps at the mission level, and looking. I think the nirvana at the far extreme is when we start doing this across government. Think about where are we sharing across. Our goal now is just let's just focus on the departmental level and think about how to get that done. The key elements, I think, to a lot of this, if you turn to page 7, I'll talk about the early results and some of the learnings we had on this process there were sort of 3 essential elements to doing this process right. One was just the establishment of these investment review boards, institutionalizing that in a way that can drive the right behavior, the right look, cascade decision making in the way that can do it, and we applaud your help on that. And that's been and there's been follow-on help where you've actually helped to deliver training and looking at some of this stuff, thinking about how that rolls up and institutionalizes inside these organizations is essential to getting the job done. The other secret ingredient of that we uncovered through this process, and I think and it was very apparent in the meetings we had with all of you, is that investment review boards aren't IT investment review boards. They're enterprise-wide investment review boards. We had to have looking at human capital, real property, other infrastructure, IT, all should be laid on the table as levers we get to pull as a leadership team and think about pulling that stuff together. And so the second level, the second essential piece, other than IRBs, are valuation models. Thinking about how do I get a common view across my enterprise to value these different investments. And so we learned a lot in our trip to Adobe on valuation models and some of our other visits. And we're now delivering training to agencies on actually how to establish a rigor behind valuing this people investment versus this IT investment versus this other investment, and normalize that across so you can actually stack rank this stuff and understand where you draw the line and where to invest and where not to invest. And then the third component, and this is probably more relevant in government is the role of the CIO and the authority of the CIO to actually reach into the dark corners, to have the authority, have the seat at the table in the investment review board, and then reach down and look at that. And so we're looking at, starting to institutionalize that. This office put out a memo about a year ago. It was the first one that was issued from me on this topic, and we've been really working hard to figure out how to drive that behavior.
CIOs are weak staff at many agencies.
Many agencies, if they were in a component, they had more budget and more authority than they maybe now have at the top of the org chart, which is an interesting notion, as you can imagine. So there are some agencies out there that are doing really great things. Department of Interior is a great example where there's now one CIO, this guy right to my right, Bernie Mazer, at the department. The component CIOs have a different title, they have a different structure, and senior leadership is really kind of bought into.
Bernie, contrast that to 4 years ago.
This is a Cole Porter song, Night and Day? Contrast it to 4 years ago is the tenor of the CIO within the Department of the Interior was as a policy shop. There was no service delivery, no assuring the delivery of results or measurements, or looking really at the investment from a strategic or mission driver perspective.
How many bureau CIOs were there?
We had 30 people that nominated themselves as CIOs.
So these guys have gone from one guardrail to another. Right?
Gives the meaning to the word chief and CIO.
I suppose from a human element perspective, there are a lot of significant driven people. But
I mean, Steve, this has now become a model.
Yeah.
Gone from a worst practice to a best practice.
Yeah, and we're starting. We've seen this at a few agencies. In different extremes. The Veterans Administration actually did this through statute a couple of years ago, and other things. The Klinger-Cohen Act that actually creates the role of CIO in government actually begins by saying the head of agency shall, and has all the information. And I think we're just now getting at that inflection point where the view of IT as sort of more of a discretionary thing, tipping over into more of a strategic thing, is starting to be realized, and it's leadership at Interior, leadership at many agencies are starting to see this and realizing, wow, I can do things not only better, faster, cheaper in my operations, I can connect with constituents, I can up the productivity of my employees, I can do all those things that all of you have certainly realized, I'm sure, in your organizations many years ago. And so we're right at that inflection. And IRB's valuation and CIO authorities are sort of what we feel are sort of in this first wave, the institutional elements of that. And the future of this process is, we learned a lot, in the way we gathered data, the way we're going to do this. This is going to be a continuous thing. The government's just going to start doing portfolio stats every year. We're going to pull it in earlier in the year so it better aligns with our budget cycles, and start to just encourage through both inspire and push to move the departments up that maturity model into getting there. Some of the early results, we're actually going to be announcing kind of the macro results in the very near future, but we're going to, and I mentioned sort of a window of about $500 million last time we met. By the results I've seen, we are going to greatly, by orders of magnitude, exceed that, and you'll see that happen. But some early results on page 7. Social Security Administration is doing enterprise purchasing for their computer refresh. It's 56% savings per unit. I mean, it's just incredible what's waiting out there. About $60 million next year happening in this.
Can you just stop you on that, though, for a second?
Yeah.
What's interesting is, when I see these words, computer refresh, you mentioned the word architecture.
Yeah.
And so the question is, have we adopted kind of the most current architecture as we think about this computer refresh? And we're not going to necessarily just replace what we had, because you used the word architecture earlier appropriately, and I think that's one of the biggest opportunities if we think about how the state of the art is changing. Yes. With virtualization and other things. Are we taking advantage of that, or are we kind of replacing what we had?
Very much so. And there's in May, I also, about the same time as launched this very grand digital strategy for government that just put out bring your own device guidance, talks about sort of thinking about the refreshing enterprise architecture, virtualization, at-home use, all this stuff in a secure and private way. And so there are, this is all lining up. They're all rubber ducks all in the same stream from a delivery standpoint.
The reason I say that is because 58 million then may not represent the full savings. Because
That's right.
if you think about what should happen is your help desk cost should go down. All the other things around it should go down. So
Right.
there may be actually a bigger number. This may be almost like the capital cost that
Yeah.
you're seeing.
But it's system cost saving.
It is.
It's the total cost of ownership. The total cost of ownership is probably.
Absolutely. I don't know, Bernie, you want to add anything to that? Because
Yeah.
you're the last example on that.
On the left, when we look, the aspects when we look at architecture in the U.S. government, it's been a promising effort for 10 years, and we're really looking at what we're using the term architecture you can use. So when we look at it from a business perspective, like within the Department of Interior, we are using our enterprise architects to create business domains for things like financial management, procurement systems, human resource systems, and then also with our mission drivers, like we're a revenue collection agency for oil and grazing, cattle and all that. So we're looking at an architect's perspective, all those applications there. When you get into the technical architecture, this goes when we're looking at with cloud first and the digital strategy. What we're looking at is, all right, we've got these life cycles of 3 to 5 years, we need to swap out some of this equipment. But some of the things that we're looking at is that's really from an asset mentality perspective. We're moving towards a service delivery. We want to really, our customers and the constituents within the Department of Interior, they just want data and information. And who is hosting that physicality of where those things are, we're indifferent to that. So we are embarking upon a lot of activities following OMB's guidance and actually leadership is where are those things that we can move out to the cloud, or where are those things that we can look at from a federal or a private market space to look at those types of things. So we mentioned aspects like with virtualization. We are in the midst of a data center consolidation initiative. That's a physicality. A lot of times consolidation in and of itself will only save 10 to 15% of cost. But then if you look at new models of delivering those things like from the cloud and the like, the savings can be realized 20, 30, 40, 50% on those things.
And a lot of the portfolio stack conversations were around service delivery as a model to think about kind of the inflection. Many times investment review boards have been around in government for some time. They were more of a budget scrub tool where people would get together and say, okay, central management of the White House told us we need to cut 5% from our budget. Let's figure out how we peanut butter that in the least painful ways across the organization. When instead, those things should be viewed as opportunities to depreciate and opportunities to deliver service. It's not just a take motion; it's a give-take motion. And so, you're thinking about how do we do more service delivery out to the endpoints from a centralized way. I think, and that inflection from asset management to service delivery is a great thing. And the productivity gains that are going to come from a lot of these things, both embracing smarter and better mobile technology to at-home use and virtualization, I think are all going to things. And we truly believe that many of these are underrepresenting the true savings that will be seen from both productivity gains and being able to absorb work through that, as well as just real cost savings. Because if you rationalize your apps and think about that, it's likely you're probably going to optimize a data center because of it. It's likely you'll probably take up some percentage of that and move it to the cloud and cut 30 to 40% of your costs. And those aren't represented in just thinking about an email box, how much it costs per employee. And so there's going to be cascading of benefits, I think, that we see across the board. Treasury is another example where they're actually consolidating across the enterprise some of their fraud, waste, and abuse systems, and they're going to see about a 14% savings out of that. And so we have a lot, over 150 examples of very specific tactical things that are going to be done that were yielded out of portfolio stat, and we'll talk about more of that in the next couple of weeks. So part of the the request for feedback, and we sort of started the dialogue here, is as you think about the role of the CIO, as you think about the role that an investment review board plays in your enterprise, the ability to engage in and kind of monitor those dark corners. One of the biggest problems we have, and one of the things we think Portfolio Stat V2 will pick up is something I'm calling shadow IT. It's the IT that's being put on purchase cards or credit cards in your case. The little fiefdoms of people that say, I need this, and Bernie doesn't find out he's got a new data center until the PO comes across his desk and somebody has bought and set something up in a far corner field office or something like that. Are there mechanisms that you've employed to kind of engage at that level, policy, penalty, incentives? Would love to kind of understand that, because that's the next wave for us, is tackling that.
I think you got to ask yourself, why does shadow IT exist? And so you got to get to the root cause. The root cause of shadow IT is really driven by people feeling they're not getting enough service from the existing capability. And so you got to help people understand how do you deal with that problem. Because instead of, the classic issue is, I've got money in my budget, I need a service, so I'm going to go spend that money to get the service I need. When you think about it more holistically, you say, if I take the piece of the budget I have, put it into the central pot, I may get efficiencies by doing that. And you've got to change the mindset that it isn't necessarily your money that you spend on shadow IT, right? It's the businesses or the agencies' financial resources. And so you got to get to the bottom line is that service delivery isn't where it needs to be, is what creates the issue.
Go ahead, Liz.
Oh, I'm sorry. But I think in addition to that, though, you see that people want control and want their system to design it exactly as they want it.
Yeah.
So, yes, it is. I totally agree with you that, Enrique, that it is having to do with I'm not getting the service I want. But oftentimes they all want to have a very prescribed architecture, and they use that as a reason to opt out of what will get them 80% of the way there, and how much do you really need that 20% customization. Right. So it is a matter of control. And I guess the one thing I would just say, in response to that real world example, is we had to move the approval process to get rid of the C, D, and E priorities out. We had to remove, that's not mine. We had to remove the approval process from,
It's me.
okay, I feel better. From PO to actual green lighting of it, right? So the first time you see it shouldn't be when a purchase order comes across your desk. It's literally, you can't issue a purchase order without a sign off, and we had to move to that. And even though it was administratively burdensome, we delegated it to an administrative assistant who then would kind of go in and say, these are the ones, are you familiar with all of these? Because of just that reason.
Right, and what we're doing within the department, and that's actually, it's also a reflection within the portfolio stat, is, it's the procurement, or whatever the procurements are, we don't want to see them after the fact.
Exactly.
And
You
so-
can't green light anything until a signature.
What we've done in the department is any procurement over $2,500, which seems extraordinarily small, is it's subject to the CIO's approval. And some of those things, we have exemptions for emergency requests for things like that. But what we're encouraging the bureaus and the offices to do is to give us yearly plans of where they are. And one of the things that we're doing with the yearly plans, this is where I'm paying homage and just an endless gratitude for the PMAB, is when you guys invited us out to look at how you were doing things. And I don't know if your initial impulse was to say, is the government allergic to like private sector practices or not? We were certainly not doing that. And one of the things I want to reflect on, and it's related, because it's so complex, is the vendor management function that we have created within the Department of Interior. Its classic thing is and I'll just use this as a small example with vendor management officer, is we have multiple disciplines within the U.S. government. So we've got a computer specialist that just focuses on the box. We have a procurement specialist that ensures that the administrative record is okay, so we're not subject to an unfair procurement. We have others that are looking at from a strategic sourcing aspect and all of that. But there's a hybridization of skills that were never there within our workforce to say, I need to have someone that has the interplay, that knows some contracting, and knows about technology, and then also knows about the landscape of who those technology vendors are. And so one of the things that we did when we visited with you all was to say, okay, how can we start up a vendor management office? And our first pass at the gate when we did an announcement, we didn't get the right candidates. We had candidates emerging out of what we call our capital planning activities, or our enterprise architecture activities, or a contract specialist. So we had to redo the whole application again, and then really focus on what we call these skills and abilities about, do you know about licenses? Do you know about who are the players like in a particular sector like telecommunications? Do you know how to work with other people? Do you know how to work with contracting officers? Do you know how to work with budget specialists? Do you know how to work with the financial management specialist? And I can say that based on your insights that you provided from the visits and everything is, this month we're going to be paneling some candidates for that. But we are, it's a labor of love that we're doing in terms of moving this attitude, it's my money, I have the right to do whatever I want with it, and we're really moving it into, and I don't say it publicly too much, but we're looking at it from an architectural or a strategic perspective on, these are the things that are necessary to accomplish the mission, and then how can we look at it from a more enterprise or horizontal perspective of helping you to accomplish that mission.
Can I just, following up on that, a comment and a question. I was going to make the same comment that Liz did. My experience with the shadow IT has to do with the desire for customization and this notion that, and it relates to Enrique's point, it's I can't get exactly what I want, therefore I'm going to go do it myself. So they're kind of related points. And I'm wondering, and it goes to your question here about how do we ensure that portfolio staff plans are executed upon effectively. My question is, to what extent are the financial goals that are being identified in these plans built into the budget process such that they have to deliver on them, so that it doesn't become a sort of nice to do, go see what you can get and we'll do it. To what extent is it actually built into the process? Because it seems to me if you actually establish these savings goals and they can only achieve it through the kind of rigor you're describing, and it doesn't allow for customization and freelancing and doing your own thing, they'll have to achieve those goals, and it ensures the plans are executed, and it minimizes shadow. It's a virtuous circle.
Right.
It does require a little bit of command and control, no doubt. But so my question is this embedded in the budget processing, or is this a sort of collateral exercise?
Glad you asked. This is the first year, in sort of an unprecedented way, we have dovetailed this. And the way we did it was our budget guidance that is being played out right now was basically that departments, in a cascading way, had to cut 10% of the OpEx column. And we just said, and we gave them categories of here's the stuff we want to see cut. You're going to reach it through portfolio stat. We're going to sit right with you, and we're going to work on getting 10% out. We're going to automatically give you 5% back. But you have to spend that 5% in these other categories of things, citizen-facing, productivity, things that align with kind of our architectural principles and sort of the spirit of what we're doing here. And then we ask departments to give us 5% of priority add-backs. Tell us in a prioritized list what additional 5% of things you would do to net to zero. And then that gives us a lever at sort of senior leadership levels to look across the whole of government and say, these guys are being smarter here, they're smarter here. We can aggregate based on presidential priorities. We can do other things that we look at to sort of think about how we shape the macro budget from a federal level. But it sort of gave us the tools to basically incent this behavior. I'd say, on the whole, looking through a lot of the government and seeing what's coming through portfolio stat, we've been pretty successful in that. I think it's starting to do. It's very much a crawl, walk, run thing to change culture, and I think we're still in the crawl stage. But I think as we get to V2 of this and V3, it's great learning. The question, is beyond that. We do budgeting once a year. How do you instill this culture of sort of where ROI is realized, throughout the year is sort of what we're probably struggling with the most.
So there's two. I want to make sure that I'm playing a little bit of the timekeeper here.
Yeah, please.
There's two major hardwirings. One, Jeff, what you just did, which is budget, and the other, Steve talked about earlier, which is the CIO that really is, like Bernie now, a strong CIO, according to Dan, who's the COO or CEO of the organization. I think we're pretty convinced that we want to really push on that. And we have the ability to take it from a concept to 25 Bernies across the government. We believe it's right answer because it's how we're going to ultimately get strategic sourcing done. It's how we're ultimately going to have strong portfolio stats. It's also, importantly, how we're going to attract the very best and brightest to do the job. because in policy shops, you're not going to get lots of burns. But before we do that real hard push, is there any, hey, slow down, caution here about what I guess could be, to pick up what you just said, Jeff, could be characterized a little bit as command and control? I think it is.
But that's what it needs to be.
I just want to make sure before we make that push, because we're about to gear up and really go toe to toe and get it done.
I mean, in this area, I think we all say our experience is that it took that
Absolutely.
to get it done.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is one area where it does take that.
I mean, to me, it's very similar to the conversation we had last time about strategic sourcing. There are some things that require customization. There's some things that are strategic that should be agency determined or, in our world, business unit focused. And there's some things that shouldn't be. And, you know, you got to make the call and be honest about it, it seems to me.
And I think the way to reinforce that is, because it is command and control, and we've all experienced it, but as much as possible, even though it may seem insignificant, sprinkle the stories, examples, and vignettes as to why.
Yeah.
So it's the constant in our world, well, corporate wants to do it, not the division.
Right.
And it's lack of empowerment and $2,500 approval, and it goes against autonomy, and you hear all the objections.
$25 approval.
Right.
2,500. Okay. But
You thought the numbers were big in government.
Yeah, the flip side is any reinforcement in examples, illustrative,
Exactly,
simple
where everyone's
examples
benefited.
Yeah.
of Interior does this, Social Security does this, Treasury does this. And even though we're doing X contraction, the life cycle total cost of ownership is Y. And don't assume that people know that. And so to draw that linkage is really, really, really important, because it takes you from a big brother punitive, I'm smarter than you are, to a we're all in this, I need your help.
That's great.
Yeah, and I was going to make a comment about the command and control. Sign me up for it, but I have a feeling that your employees are probably more similar to Red Cross employees than for-profit employees.
Yeah.
And there's a combination here of setting the budget to be restrictive enough that people can't go off on the customization route, because this is why you get the shadow IT. And customization is really expensive. But rather than saying, thou shalt not do this, that, or the other thing, if the budget is set in such a way, they'll say, whoa, I can't afford the shadow IT. So in a way, you're almost forcing the issue for them to abandon the shadow IT. And then there's the appeal. You don't have financial incentives. You don't pay as well as the for-profit world. And there, the appeal is, along with stories, you know, is this a good use of our taxpayers' dollars? I mean, I always ask that question over and over again. Is this a good use of our donors' hard-earned dollars? You know, if they were in the room with us right now, would they be pleased to see that we have 700 different IT departments sprinkled around the American Red Cross? That appeal that I said once, literally everybody started saying, no, we've got to centralize it, we've got to purchase together. I mean, people are working here for a reason.
And the reason they're working here is the mission of their agency,
Exactly.
not the back office of their
Exactly.
agency.
They
And what
hate
this
the back
allows-
office of the agency, really.
And we're capped in terms of how much money we can spend, which I think is a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And therefore, it forces our back office to be as efficient as it possibly can, so we can spend more money
On the mission.
Right.
So that's the
That's the
incentive,
appeal.
as you said.
So there's the carrot, the mission, and the stick is just set the budget so low. And this is what we wound up doing at the American Red Cross. And it was amazing. Our chapter said, take this, take all the IT, centralize marketing, centralize our HR systems, because it was an affordability issue. And everyone wanted to fulfill the mission and didn't really care, to Jeff's point, about the back office. So.
And another, I would just add, another important carrot is back to your point, Steve, earlier, is if people see the systems improving. You know,
Right.
that
Yes.
if you have antiquated systems and you aren't able to get your work done, and all of a sudden, you know, new folks are coming in and they may be, you know, laying down the law, but at the same time, they're making things better. so you can be more productive and the systems work better. I think that's an important
I think it
part
gets
of
to the
it.
stories thing too.
Right.
Yeah.
And I
Right.
think
So
that-
you're not just, being punitive, you're actually helping people and
Right.
assisting them. And that's an important part of
So
it.
we should lift up. The first couple of years we spent a fair amount of time getting deep, piloting, picking some low-hanging fruit. We started to shift as Steve arrived in IT trained to how do we start to hardwire in so that things go beyond the time we're here. I think portfolio stat, which would not have happened but for PMAB's input, is across all of government, one of the top 5 hardwiring in things we've done. So, but for this group, it would not have happened. Steve's had a little role in that too. But I want to thank you, and we guys just keep pushing on it. We're on
Can I ask one quick question? I know we're time constrained, but this is a question I'm going to ask a lot, or maybe as we go through this. There's going to come a point in time, maybe it's soon or maybe it's 4 years from now, when
I'm not tracking.
when there's going to be a transition of some kind, okay?
Yes.
This is a non-political comment.
Yes.
How do we sustain something like this so it continues beyond the tenure of the great people that have done it?
Yeah, I think part of it is policy, budget formulation, starting to get it in. The key though is culture. Teaching agencies how to run an investment review board, teaching discipline how to institutionalize the notion of depreciation, steal from the bottom of the list and give to the top, steal from the OPEX column to give to the CAPEX column. That there are pressures applied to our government right now that will drive that behavior. We're just trying to fast track it. Cybersecurity, fiscal pressure, consumerization of technology, all those things are applying so much pressure to the function of IT and government.
But Jeff,
we'll get there. I think it's...
and something like portfolio stat, if we were to stop now, I'd worry about it. Because we're not, to use Deborah, what you were talking about, it hasn't quite gotten all the way through the cycle of wins. And assuming we have a little more time to do it, it'll get there. Because remember, Steve's great deputy Lisa's here. At OMB, Steve comes and hopefully stays for a long time and then eventually goes, but the bulk of Steve's team is here to stay. The bulk of Bernie's team is there to stay. So as long as we can get at a macro level, Deborah, what you were talking about, which is success, I think it'll be hardwired in. That's great. And OMB and the agencies are working together. But it's hard, and that's why we got to pick our few things and hang on hard.
That's great.
Good job.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you, guys.
John Berry, who all of you know well. How are you, John?
I am doing great. Thank you all. And before some good news, and to thank you all for the training program that we now have up fully running for our senior executives, sort of in 3 components of it. We have sort of an immediate onboarding training, which is, you come in the door rather than just being given the keys to the office, you now have a welcome approach and some of the core briefings that you need to achieve success. And then we had a program that you've heard from our Dan and my colleague at the VA, Scott Gould, the Deputy Secretary there, who's helped us to put together a program called Leading Edge, which is focusing more on career development for senior executives who have been in for a longer period of time. And but we have this critical juncture, and as many of you pointed out to us, was that the period you've really got to focus, where you've got, they're excited, they're wanting to make a difference, they're coming in the door, is empower your people in that first 18 months and really hit them hard with a formal training program that is rigorous and effective. We piloted that over the past year with working with each of you and your HR shops, and I'm extremely grateful for that. As a way to get to the last question, which was just how do you keep these things alive, we have formally now embedded this in the Federal Executive Training Institute, so that they have assumed the responsibility, and therefore sort of, this program will keep going.
Terrific. That's great.
And yesterday was our inaugural, we're out of the pilot phase and into a formal career phase. And we launched it yesterday, and it was about leading people. It was a 5-hour, very intensive program. And our very own Deborah Lee was our keynote speaker. And I will just highlight, these are a few of the comments that we received from the 75 senior executives who were in attendance.
Deborah says to go slow here. Are there any graphics, John?
Deborah, I just got these this morning, so I apologize. It was just yesterday. Deborah's inspiring and thoughtful presentation, refreshingly different and informative, critical private sector insights, but also her personal story during the Q&A session was very powerful. And having the business perspective and the case study was a true home run. So, Deborah, there's
Send copies to our board members.
It was really wonderful, and so we're very grateful. And
I must say I was very impressed with the group. The questions, even John opened up the session, and what was it, 8:30, 9 o'clock, and opened it up by saying, I'll take any questions. And there were lots of questions before anything, and really good questions.
They really, it's an engaged, powerful group.
Right, and I was impressed with the questions I received, so it's a good group.
Well, this is, you could see, and the overall rating of this, not just of the speakers, but the effectiveness and the organization of the program was very high. And we'll be able to share with you all, we're going to break this down, but by next week we'll have all the stats and the numbers, and we'll be able to share that through the email to each of you so you can see the direct results from this. But, again, wouldn't have happened without your help, the quality level, the focus areas to hit on. And I think what was really, one of the comments we also received, and I received this doing a break from someone, is the divergence of experience that came together in that 5 hours of retired senior execs who had been award winners, prestigious, presidential distinguished rank award winners. These are like one of 10 people in the government who win this level of award, Nobel Prize type of achievement. One of our federal employees won the Nobel Prize this past week, I should point out, at the National Institute of Standards for his work in quantum physics. Conveying that level of quality and of energy, but also having the leadership of a CEO, a major CEO, take the time to come in and bring the private sector component. It's been a phenomenal success. So, we're just grateful. Tim is in the batter's box. I think. Our next one, and this is kind of, and this goes to that last comment too about potential transition. The next course we're planning specifically on November 8th, and the thematic is leading change, amidst organizational change. Whether it is a second term or a new administration, there will be a transition, and there will be new people, there'll be new leaders, new teams. And how do you maintain that focus and energy throughout that? So that's going to be our focus. The next one, Tim is going to be our main speaker at that one from the PMAB. So November 8th, we'll be hitting off with that. And then moving into the March program, which will be business acumen, building coalitions, and then the final one of the program, results, driving results.
How do people get selected to go to these different sessions?
It's each agency solicits, we solicit from their senior executives, and the agencies, we tell them the age, the group we're aiming at here, that we're looking at. We're looking at the senior executives who are within their first 18 months. So we're looking at that cadre of your workforce, and then agencies look at, is this person in town that day, et cetera. So
and our goal is to be able to fill all that demand, right? For that first 18-month period.
Absolutely.
Everyone will cycle through.
And so yesterday we hit about, I think that final count ended up being about 82. So it was a pretty good turnout, and and we had. What we're getting better at is the last minute slots. So finding people who then have been pulled off for some emergency, who've created an opening. We have a backup team now that we can immediately slot in there, so we don't waste seats. So it's been very effective. So Can't thank you enough. And Deborah, would you like to add anything? I mean, you were there, so.
Yeah, and I did, a lot of the executives there were very new. People told me stories about moving from North Carolina or other places. So that was refreshing. But, I really could feel the commitment and their desire to be better. I mean, even though they were new to SES, they were mid-career people. So they had experiences other places, and they were, excited about bringing those experiences to bear in helping the country and the government, but also the desire to be better. And you could tell that by the questions, just really thoughtful questions. And the question of incentives did come up a couple of times.
In what context? What were they asking?
Are there, I think you were asked, what other incentives are there other than, since there's not a lot of money to be passed around in government? And John gave a very good answer. And I love your statement about, being upbeat, and if you have a bad day, stay at home, because because this, leadership requires passion and commitment, and, everyone's looking up to you. So I thought that was very good. But I was just really impressed by the group, the diversity of the group, their backgrounds. It was very impressive. So
Thank you.
I was glad to do it.
Very
And
well.
they seemed interested in BET. You worry that an entertainment industry company may seem very far removed from what they do in government, but you realize that management is management, and passion is passion, and the stories translate. So it was a lot of fun.
Really, really great stuff. And then on the next program, the standardized appraisal system, we've gotten that out into sort of the top 10, the largest agencies of the government, all up and running now. You see there on this sheet, page 13, the one thing that I'm going to try to really press hard on is I believe that we can get 14 done in 13. And so my team is just hearing that right now, but I've really been looking at this, and I think we can push this up a year and get it done. The success rate, the buy-up, the take-up of this has been phenomenal. Everybody who's done it has come away and said, why didn't we do this before? The point of view said, the continuity and the consistency for this group is, as you all know, it's, in a 1.8 million size workforce of something we call the federal government, we have this veneer of 6,000 people that are our senior executives. And, so, treating them more with greater consistency and holding that standard of professionalism, it's so important that we do that. And so I think we can, our goal should be to achieve the 96%, almost 100% of the government in the 13 time frame.
That's fantastic. Jeff, to take on your right question, this is great because it'll get done and it won't get replaced.
It's embedded now.
It's embedded.
Right.
However, that's an important step. The real value will be in managers taking these seriously,
Right.
putting in the time and energy. So
Right.
it's the right base for it, and it's a hell of an accomplishment.
Right.
But then off that base, we've got
quality
to
of
get
the-
people focused on this to make it a priority.
Well, but they see the value, right?
Yep.
Presumably. So that becomes a virtuous circle.
Yes, but we got to get that humming. But to get this foundation in place
Great accomplishment.
is great. Total right answer. And no one's going to undo that. No one's going to say, I want to undo a...
Management.
But that's our hope, with things like just going to something like the resume. I mean, anybody who comes in who wants to go back to knowledge, skills, and ability essay questions would be nuts.
Just has to recruiting.
we hope
John's
that-
moved to a resume basis for recruiting, which is so right answer.
Well, moving to consistency, I think also is a signal to the SESs that they have a career in government, and it doesn't start all over again in another branch of government. So it's just a way that is telling them you care about them, I think. So
The movement that, one of the things we discussed at a previous meeting, and I've tried this now in 3 different positions in my government career over the past 25 years. It is real hard to to get the movement of the people that you really want to move. You want to be able to move your best. But because what you have at the top of agencies is so few people who are there that you can, who have the depth and that you can really lean on and count on. And there's a tendency of, I can't spare, I'm here for 18 months, 2 years, I can't spare this person for a 9-month rotation type of thing. Even though we know the importance of it, we know the criticality of it. So one of the things we've been working with the DepSecs on is, it may not work in our case at the SES, because what you don't want is people saying, well, I have this SES that I'd love to move, and, but that's the exact wrong person we want to be shifting that over. So,
what we have done is we've hardwired in rotation before SES.
Yes, and so that's where that focus has been, to take sort of at the what we call our 13, 14, 15 level, and are now focusing that rotational effort at that level, and we're finding better success. Yeah, we're finding better success there than
at the right age.
Exactly.
So.
John, any questions or a request for counsel from this group?
No, and I also want to thank you. I asked for your help on some of our, and it was, you gave me very important feedback on our employee viewpoint survey and how you approach what actual tools and mechanisms you use. And we're actually going to be coming out to a couple of the firms and kicking the tires more directly with our detailed people, with your detailed people. But even just the initial input you gave us since the last meeting, I think helped us to recraft a direction we were moving. So very, very helpful and grateful for that.
And you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I might just add that conversation we had at the last meeting about the painfulness of going through a real review for people really informed what we were doing. Because what we found, as Jeff and John just said, you're not going to see people go back to these old-fashioned ways of doing business. We, in the implementation of this reform, had to really overcome deep institutional biases in at least two dimensions. Number one, we are par excellence a technical agency. So the already present predilection to sort of take SES away from its roots to thinking about areas of expertise as opposed to your top veneer of leaders. We had gone pretty far down that road. And working very closely with John, we came up with other approaches. But we found you really had institutional concerns to begin with. People were not comfortable, first of all, making the shift to a leadership orientation. And secondly, being candid with themselves, with their superiors. This is the conversation we had last time, and with the people they're evaluating. This goes together with the phrase I think you just used of peanut buttering. There tended to be this sort of homogenization of evaluations which became sort of empty, relatively speaking. And so actually, when we went from the 4 levels to the 5 levels, it facilitated moving away from that because you were able to acknowledge specific nuances that otherwise you're making a pretty draconian choice, and people don't want to fall too far into the next bin. So what it took in our case was really going to workshops. We had to make training in the initial instance mandatory because there was a lot of inertia against these kinds of things. And then people, as they were forced to face, and I guess Greg was making a point about specific examples, with the names removed to protect the innocent, specific personnel challenges that had been faced and how people dealt with them. Then the people, our SESers came back and says, you know what, this actually is helpful. And I think it facilitated the whole integration, and I think we're all of us preoccupied by how you weave something into the culture and DNA of the organization beyond the changing of forms, which is absolutely indispensable. I would call that a necessary but not sufficient condition. So I think that it is now well launched. It's going to take a couple of cycles to get there. But then you will, ideally, end up with this kind of cadre where you can take this guy from there and put her over there and so forth and really get the benefits of management. I guess the only other thing I would say is we had already been starting to move in that direction because we recognized in interviewing our own people about their level of job satisfaction that although they had become sort of inured to this rating system that was pretty undifferentiated and not really sort of painful wire scrubbing. We have found that now that people are going through this process, that you are actually getting the cultural acceptance. It didn't take as long as I feared. People, especially SCSers, are used to being head of the class. And when you do it from the top with them, then it's easier for them to carry out down through the organization. So I think that it's going to continue to be a static process. We should take feedback and push that through so if it doesn't go, it will get stale, I think. But I really think that we have now turned a corner in terms of moving SES back toward the original conception that John has been working so hard for the last couple of years to do.
Right.
Anything before we switch gears?
I just would make the comment, this is fantastic how far this has come. I mean, when we started talking about this, whenever it was a year or so ago, this was an area I personally have some passion for, and I just congratulate you guys on great achievements.
Well, we're really going to, we're already looking forward in terms of building the the framework of work that we believe will help regardless of what happens in November, going forward of what do we need in the civil service in the workforce of the 21st century. And one of the key questions we've started to wrestle with, I was out in Portland, Oregon last week with Nike, and we're looking at classification system, which has, was developed in the, 19th century. And it governs, issues of great complexity in the federal government. But one of the things that, and it gets into very sensitive areas of, how do you achieve equal pay for equal work but still have enough flexibility to achieve some of the hybridization that Interior was talking about, and recognizing, people need multiple skill sets in the 21st century, not silos. And so we're started working on that program looking forward. And again, I think this is one where each of you have there is no right magic answer here. And wanting to learn from your experience and how you've wrestled with these very interesting and difficult topic is going to be, I think, critical for us going forward. So I'll be working with Jeff on, we'll have to figure out how we tee this up in such a way that we don't waste your time. But I think it would be a next one where your input early on could revolutionize this approach.
Thanks.
All right.